I have to say I'm grateful to Jed despite the fact that of all the colleagues I know, he's cost me the most money. It's all about the cameras, of course. Every time I visited from the East Coast, there was always a new camera, and it was always the best camera ever. So this is picking up on the theme of gadgets that we've touched on in other fora. Technology does progress, but is there really a revolution in imaging every 3 months? Tom Kuhn might indeed be surprised. Well, I eventually became convinced and took the bait with the result that I now have quite a collection. As I told Mary, Jed is to blame for this. I also blame Sammy's camera, our local equivalent of a drug den at Allen in Colorado. We heard last night from Miles Jackson about the mysterious emails he receives at predictable times. He's not the only one to get such messages, though mine tend to come around the clock. Recently, I'd been away from email for a few days, and when I finally got back to it, I found 3 messages from Jed. First one said, "Don't go to Sammy's. They have the new Panasonic S1R." The second, a day later, "Well, I just ordered the Panasonic. It's coming on Monday." And the third was on Monday, "Well, the Panasonic is the best camera I've ever had." So this happened about 2 weeks ago. This is a very recent camera, and the time cycle of renewal has now increased greatly from 1 year, which we heard earlier from Don Howard in 2012 in Athens. It's now about 3 weeks sometimes, or 3 months. The story continues, so I'm waiting on the Panasonic to see if it really is a paradigm shift. I have here another camera, which I purchased on Jed's recommendation, the Nikon Z7, so I challenge you to a shootout at your earliest convenience on that. So coming then to business and more serious matters, the topic of our panel is science in the stars. This is a theme that has, of course, figured prominently in Jed's recent work on the zodiac of Dendera and also Newton's chronology. And we heard a bit about this yesterday. My understanding is that not all of our accomplished speakers are going to talk about stars. They will all perhaps talk about things in the sky, or perhaps not. They are at least all stellar practitioners of the kind of scholarship that Jed represents, namely work that simultaneously draws on close reading of primary sources in the original languages, pays the closest possible attention to the details of their scientific content, and explores broad themes in the history of science at the same time. So without further ado, I hand over the podium to our first speaker, my dear friend and colleague, Elahe Kheirandish, an expert in Arabic, Islamic, and Persian science. So Elahe, please.
With many thanks to the invitation for this exciting event and its introduction. In the interest of time, I will read from my slide captions, which is all my presentation is as compared to the more detailed printed piece. The subject I chose for the present occasion is based on the title of Jed's co-authored book, The Zodiac of Paris, and my presentation is fittingly placed in a session titled Science in the Stars, a subject within astronomy, not optics, the more formal specialty area of both me and Jed, mine before cameras, of course. I chose the present subject not just because I admire the book Zodiac of Paris itself, but especially since through it, I could similarly expose one of the kind's historical sources, mostly for the first time, in the spirit of our distinguished scholar, with the hope that such rarely noted historical sources would have a similar fate in exciting attention and eventual publication. The 3 rather unique historical sources I have selected from the Islamic Middle Ages correspond to the 3 parts of my present subtitle as verses, places, and faces. Here I'll briefly introduce them as part of what I have called the zodiacs of Paris, with a plural S, for their comparable subjects as zodiacs and current locations as Paris, despite their distinctions in both period and medium. And I present these in an order opposite to that of my printed piece after this introductory slide. Looking at the 4 images of this first slide clockwise, we all know the one on the top left from the cover page of the published Zodiac of Paris. Of the other 3 unpublished ones, the one on the top right preserves verses involving the 12 zodiac constellations in a manuscript volume in Paris, shelf-marked Pers 169, meaning Persian, an important volume well known as the Paris Codex, which was partly published by me and my colleagues in 2015. It's many treatises. We published the most interesting one on geometrical patterns. So some people know it. The verses there in that codex attributed to the quote-unquote king of scholars, Nasiruddin Tusi, the director of the important 13th century Maragh Observatory in northwest Iran, then led me to another set of Persian verses that again attributed this time to Tusi, that uniquely aligned the 12 zodiac constellations with 7 known planets at the time, all in rhymed verse. Moving clockwise, the next image in the lowest right represents places, in this case recorded in the Panis manuscript of the 11th century Book of Instructions by Abu Rayhan Biruni in Paris, among other copies. This is a text composed in both Arabic and Persian and dedicated to a certain female figure named Rayhane, curiously, nobody knows who that is, in both those languages, and ends with constellation images in some of its many beautiful manuscripts worldwide. Not this image that we have here, which I will return to. Biruni's Book of Instruction, Tafhim in its original title, has a rarely noted striking section aligning zodiacs and places, from cities to regions. I have selected this image linked to one of those cities to show that representation of zodiac constellations has gone beyond textual material, such as a manuscript, in this case, a physical object in the form of a stained glass window in a historic house, which is comparable in time, if not place, to our prototype Zodiac of Paris. The last image on the lower left is from a key source in the form of the opening folio of an important manuscript now in Paris. This round script forms the opening folio of that Paris manuscript, significantly carrying the name of the early 15th century Timurid student prince Ulugh Beg from the Samarkand School and Observatory. I call him a student prince as he actually sat in class and then conquered land and came back to class. And I thought that he would be a fitting figure to highlight here, as his death date of 1449 is exactly 500 years earlier than the birth of Jed. The Timurid manuscript you see folios from on this slide's 2 images is one of 2 illustrated manuscripts in Paris of the famous Book of Constellations of Abdurrahman Sufi, Sowar al-Kawakib, from the late 10th century, a manuscript copy with better illustration than the other one by far. On the right, you see the constellation Taurus, which is the birth sign of Jed, as illustrated in the outstanding Timurid manuscript in Paris. I have included another folio from the valuable manuscript, the Constellation Gemini, on the right, which is associated with the place of the stained glass window on the left, namely the city of Qazvin, the important capital of the Safavid dynasty before Isfahan of the 10th century. But significantly for us, Gemini is also the birth sign of Diana. I started having fun with my piece when I found out that the birth signs of Jed and Diana are the constellations Taurus and Gemini, it got more interesting when historical sources had Taurus and Gemini respectively linked with Alexandria and Egypt, where Jed and Diana started their joint venture on the zodiac of Paris, inspiring my own contribution to this subject. But the real fun came when it turned out that the sum of the stars in the constellations of Taurus and Gemini and the sum of the numerical or abjad letters in the names Jed and Diana both magically added to number 70. I will present these in a later slide. As for zodiacs and verses, I would end these slides, the introductory ones, with one where each of the 12 birth signs are historically linked to one of the 7 known planets at the time. Aries and Scorpio with Mars, Taurus and Libra with Venus, Gemini and Virgo with Mercury, Cancer with the Moon, Leo with the Sun, Sagittarius and Pisces with Jupiter, and Capricorn and Aquarius with Saturn. Figure out your planet and you will have the full text in the book. Astronomical verses are also where we can find other wonders in the planets associated with Taurus and Gemini, among others, as in my final slides. But the next several slides are focused on zodiacs and phases, namely the form of constellations of fixed stars in the sky, each formed by internal and external stars. In the upper images of this slide, the internal and external stars forming the constellations Taurus and Gemini around our 2 stars here are 44 and 26, adding up to 70. In the lower caption, I have added the numerical value of the so-called abjad letters forming the names Jed and Diana, where the letter D is common between them, again adding up to 70. For example, if we have instead of the name Diana, Diane, the name of the co-author of the Zodiac of Paris, the sum of the letters in the 2 names would have added to 69, not 70, because the numerical value of the final letter A for Diana, which is Aleph in Arabic and Persian, is 1, but the letter E at the last letter of Diane would have had a 0 value, as in E in Jed's own name. So anyway, that's an interesting piece that I thought I'll add here. Here a few notes may be added about the Paris manuscript I chose for the stars of Taurus and Gemini. This manuscript of the famous Book of Constellation, which had a good circulation in Arabic and Persian as well as transmission to Europe, contains remarkable illustrations of the 48 constellations known since Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE, with 2 views, one as seen in the sky with naked eyes, of course, and one as seen on celestial globes. In Arabic, these are illustrated as early as the author's own time in the late 10th century, reportedly by his own son. And we have later ones in Persian, in the Persian tradition of this book. In this folio, we have both these views of constellations Taurus as mirror images. The same goes for the constellation Gemini, but in this case, the illustration of this constellation is not always 2 female figures, as in the Paris manuscript I have selected. In these illustrations, we have 2 male figures in one and a male and a female in the other. The male figures are in a rare manuscripts in Tehran, which I just recently laid my hands on. The male and female figures on the walls of an observatory in Jaipur, India, We also have them in the form of infants and in certain Latin manuscripts, as one in the Whipple Museum on its orrery, as Liba can tell you. And the differences of these illustrations by themselves are, each interesting subjects of study which haven't been done so far. The next few slides are samples of the 12 zodiacs, again in manuscripts beyond Paris. In this one alone, we have manuscripts from 3 different libraries in Tehran and 1 from Rampur, India, and this is a published version of these in the Illustrated Study, that book that some of you may know. In this one, this is not even from Sufi's Book of Constellations. In this case, it's a collected volume in Harvard University's Sackler Museum in Cambridge. These are the more outstanding ones that I chose. There are many, many more of these, of course. So these are samples in the textual sources, but we also have those on physical bodies, a celestial globe in London's Victoria and Albert Museum, and zodiac coins in New York's Metropolitan Museum, and there are many others, examples preserving illustrations from textual to physical sources. Most of them have not been studied. To switch to the even lesser known case of zodiac and places, one of the most important textual sources on that relation is the Book of Instructions of Abu Rayhan Biruni from the 11th century. This is a text slightly later than Sufi's Book of Constellations and earlier than the Persian translation of the latter by Nasiruddin Tusi about two centuries later, with its own important history. Not all of the manuscript copies of Biruni's text have illustrations of the constellations, but this one from the British Library on the right has it, and what you see here is an artistic adaptation of constellation Sagittarius, historically linked to the city of Esfahan, as seen on the facing tile with the famous line, Sepahan or Esfahan, half of the world, Esfahan Nesfe Jahan. Here, the artistic adaptation on the right has the creative touch of Elizabeth Kavicki here for an exhibit that I had in Brown University about 10 years ago. I end with a few words about the places and verses linked with constellations, Taurus and Gemini only. How am I doing with time? Okay. In terms of places, I have only 2 more slides. In terms of places, it is an interesting coincidence that these birth signs are historically linked with Alexandria and Egypt, places represented on the historical map like this one in the Paris Codex that I mentioned. The actual passages where such links are made are included in my printed piece, not in the original language, but in translation. That's the map that I missed showing you. In the case of verses, Taurus and Gemini are linked to Venus and Mercury respectively. Assume further associations through verses placing an instrument in Venus's hand and giving Mercury an ink and pen to write, this time aptly linking the birth signs of Jet and Diana to tools and books. To conclude with the important subject of the past, present, and future of the history of science as the main theme of the present event, I end with a note on the critically important subjects of transmission and transformation of books and tools, and my own contributions to those subjects with a focus on translations and illustrations and their roles in conceptual shifts, both those that are intended and unintended. And that's a large subject that I can't get into, but that has been my main focus, transmission and transformation. my contributions do not fall within the area of science of the stars, namely astronomy, of this present session, but within optics and mechanics, specifically the Arabic and Persian traditions of Euclid and Pappus, fittingly forming traditions that, according to their ancient Greek founders, may be called Alexandrian, after a city linked to Jet through his birth sign of Taurus, and last night we noticed in other ways. My publications of both those traditions on early optical and mechanical traditions have another Jet connection in being published in the Springer series in volumes that have long had Jet as series editor. But for the purpose of the present event marking Jet's birthday, it seemed appropriate to wear an astronomical hat and around my neck, as Bill Newman noticed, an astrolabe that was constructed by a young scholar in Istanbul. On the astronomical note, I refer you to this final image, which frames the tracing and threading of the birth signs of both Jed and Diana, reconstructed from that same Paris zodiac that we talked about, on pieces of midnight blue velvet, which stands out as the color of this whole event, from balloons and flowers to these two small bags that I brought with me that I have to share with you. Here they are. In them, I have two medal-like tiles of Taurus and Gemini, which I have to pull out, just memory lanes. And they are taken actually by us recently from an ancient Zoroastrian city of Yazd, which are sort of more mobile versions of something that you couldn't carry as a memory of this unforgettable event. Thank you both for acting as such examples, both personally and intellectually. Thank you very much for having us. Thank you.